Yesterday we saw how deeply the way physicists work changed during the interwar period and how these changes were driven by a new role assigned to science by society. And today we'll address the next main topic, the topic of the Second World War, obviously. The Second World War is so much a pursuit of the first one that it will, of course, point mostly toward the same directions. One of the most impressive consequences was the tipping of the center of gravity for physics from Germanic countries to the United States in 10 years. The events we talked about yesterday had already laid out the field for the welcoming of a major part of international physics on the other side of the Atlantic. But the trigger was obviously the rise to power of the Nazis in Germany in 1933. Just among Jewish physicists with Jewish family or left-wing political opponents, the Germanic countries saw in a few years a whole part of their scientific community fleeing Central Europe. Schrödinger chose Ireland, Born the United Kingdom, or Meitner, Sweden, but for most of them, the United States had become the most natural destination. Among the most famous ones, we could name Einstein, Bohr, Fermi, Pauli, Bethe, or Szilard. And most of them stayed in the United States once the war was over. Europe was then a devastated battleground, particularly Germany, who was placed under Allied administration. And more decisive, the economic domination of the United States became far stronger than it had become in the wake of the First War. For the second time in 30 years, USA became the creditor of Europe war effort and decided to fund the reconstruction in exchange for massive import of American products. That's what was known as the Marshall Plan. At the same time, the combination of the national scientific institutions of the interwar period with the abrupt conversion of countries to war economy, especially in the United Kingdom and the United States, led to an incredible intensification of the previous trends. Historians of science have called this new regime of science, completed with the Second World War, the big science. How big? Big in several meanings, actually. First, because of the quantitative explosion of the number of scientists, as well as the national spendings. US estimated research spendings were multiplied 1,000-fold between 1935 and 45. Second, because of the organization of scientific work in big laboratories, mobilizing hundreds to thousands of researchers. And finally, because of the organization of this work around large instruments, like the particle accelerators, large telescope, or computers. Since the states were generously funding these activities, it was decided to fix practical goals to scientists, decided by central administration, and to organize research in collaborative units, not unlike industrial organization. Around these practical goals that could help to win the war, multidisciplinary teams were established with almost unlimited funds. All across the United States and the United Kingdom, scientists were enlisted like this, with the idea that scientific achievements could decide the outcome of the world conflict. And in a way, it did. The leading position acquired by Great Britain in the development of radar technologies during the conflict were the highest importance for the Navy and the Air Force. The field of operations research appeared, combining computation and mathematical analysis to help solving the huge organizational issues of the war. Cybernetics and information theory arose from study of communication problems and automatic guidance for air defense systems. And we have to mention the development of digital computers for ballistic calculations or code breaking. If you have seen the movie, The Imitation Game, about the work of Alan Turing during the war, you already know the importance the cracking of German intelligence codes took to break the German naval blockade of Great Britain. And above all, the bomb, obviously. I won't be long on this well-known story. Just a few remarks on the importance of this episode for fundamental physics development. From the first publication on nuclear fission in 1939 to Hiroshima bombing, only 6 years had passed. During this interval, the handful of nuclear physicists in the world informed of these works alerted their governments about the potential military use of this fundamental discovery. All open publication on this topic stopped. And in 1945, the most frightful weapon ever built by humankind killed 70,000 people instantly and 200,000 more during the next 5 years in one unique explosion. I think there is no need to stress more the importance took by fundamental physics in the 20th century. The team of Frédéric Joliot-Curie in Paris was probably the most advanced in this subject in 1939, but he preferred to stay in the occupied France, and all work stopped until the end of the war. Meanwhile, Robert Oppenheimer was charged by Roosevelt to be the scientific leader of the Manhattan Project. Part of the most brilliant physicists who had fled Central Europe just some years ago worked with him on the atomic bomb with the assistance of more than 150,000 of engineers, technicians, and workers across the United States. The physicist team settled the laboratory famous of Los Alamos, a kind of secret city built in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico, which basically became the prototype of modern fundamental physics laboratory. For the study of the nuclear detonation, it is there that the mathematician Stanislav Ulam invented the Monte Carlo methods and proceeded to the first computer simulations. For scientists, this big science meant a loss of their autonomy. They weren't the only ones to decide on their research priorities, instrument choices, or colleagues. In the same time, military power wasn't anymore, for the first time, a demographic issue, but a scientific one. And if states could discipline and organize scientific research, this scientific issue could become itself an economic one. This situation led to a kind of historical mutual compromise between scientists and political power. This compromise was set out in the most famous and clear way by Vannevar Bush, a scientific advisor of the President Roosevelt and MIT researcher on computers, in a public report to the President of the United States, published in 1945. Its title was Science, the Endless Frontier. Bush was requesting the perpetuation of the national budgets without limit they knew during the war, but argued for an ideal of autonomy for pure science. In exchange, society and political power could count on rapid return on investment in terms of economic growth or military applications. With the example of nuclear physics in mind, fundamental physicists encountered no difficulty to convince military authorities to pay huge amounts to let them investigate whatever research lines they would like. Something big and useful would certainly come out of this one day or another. Obviously, this solution established itself thanks to the context of the Cold War. But I keep this part for my last talk tomorrow. Indeed, I have not talked at all about the USSR until now, which, however, was maybe the first country to enter in this big science regime, despite its economic weakness compared to the United States. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Question and comments?
I'm not a historian, but I think that perhaps there was a period in the United States where the military was funding an enormous amount of basic research. The Office of Naval Research and the Air Force Office of Scientific Research poured an enormous amount of money into areas like particle physics until they were stopped in the early 70s by the government, which said you should only be paying for things that have military reasons. But there was a very long period in there where they were pouring money into basic research without expecting any return on it. And I'm too young to have actually experienced that myself, but I know many very distinguished physics departments that were floated on Navy and Air Force money, and probably others too. Maybe some of the older people here.
Well, as one of the older people, Willie Fowler's lab at the Kellogg Radiation Lab at Caltech was funded by the Office of Naval Research, certainly when I was there in the late 60s, and that continued for some time. Can I add one other sociological thing that I meant to mention earlier that relates to some degree with the theoretical contribution to all of this? John Bacall, after the solar neutrinos were sorted out, and it's clear that his calculations were correct, was interviewed, I think, by a New York television station, and he was asked, how do you feel now that your theory has been proven to actually be correct? He says, I feel like one of those people, incarcerated people who suddenly have been absolved by the DNA evidence that after being castigated for years and years. So one has to recognize that theorists stick their neck out as well in the process of this combination.
Yeah, no, I just want to know, do we have an idea why some physicists and most of the European physicists choose to go to the US and few, like the French, goes to Canada and so doesn't participate to the Manhattan Project? On which criteria did they choose this destination?
They speak French in Canada.
That's a good question. Yeah.
It wasn't their choice. The project in Canada was the establishment of a reactor, Z2, I think, or Z1 it was called, and it was not really integrated closely with the Manhattan Project because people that, not to put too fine a point on it, that they didn't trust for one reason or another because of their political associations or their family's political associations or their nationality, ended up working in Canada. There were a lot of British people there who weren't really in that category. They were, in fact, leaders of developing this second site. But the Chalk River site never got into building bombs. They were building a reactor to assist with what was being done at the Manhattan site. And then eventually after that, they went into producing the Canadian-style CANDU nuclear reactor for power purposes. There's never been any militarily related research done at Chalk River. And by the way, Bruno Parnacorvo was one of the people who ended up in Chalk River because of communist associations in his family. So that's the nature of the Chalk River versus Manhattan Project, as far as I know.
Thank you, sir.
I want to make a point concerning Europe. The European operation of big science in the last 50 years has been a forerunner of the unification of a reasonably governmented Europe, and has played a very positive example of how international collaboration can function if the objective topics are number one and the politics is only number two. Now, I say that because I don't tell you any surprise that this stage of happiness is in great danger. Europe is at the edge of losing its liberal traditions, which make the big science of CERN type or also large-scale operations and self-understandable collaboration between institutes from all different European countries, of course, also transatlantic and everything, but since you are a historian, don't talk only about the big ones, the Russians and the Americans. Think about Europe, because we are in a critical state, and we have to recognize that and fight for it.
Right. I only spoke of the United Kingdom in Europe because I concentrated on the war today. But obviously, I wanted to talk a bit about the CERN, for example, tomorrow, and the importance it took for European construction. Exactly. Big science in Europe was used as a tool and an engine for European construction after the Second World War, obviously, because at this time, France was occupied, so nuclear physicists, as I said, stopped their research. And in Germany, it was different. The one who have not fled worked with the Nazis, like Heisenberg, and the other had already flee. So, but you're really right for the period of the Cold War, after the Second World War, and indeed, we are at the end of a period like this, 2 days.
So I just wanted to highlight that something I'm very proud of and like to brag about to non-scientists is how we have bridged over many different societies. For instance, we know of big differences in groups. For instance, there were groups of scientists that were communists in the Powell group and cosmic ray physicists in Japan and so on. So there were definitely big political differences that people could fight over. But despite these things, we had cooperated even during the difficult days of the Cold War. We remained friends with our colleagues our physicist colleagues in the Soviet Union, and physics overrode the silly political differences and played, I think, an important role in a lot of these countries in terms of influencing or diffusing perhaps some of the antagonisms between these different societies. So I think we should not forget to brag about our role in a more worldwide view of our place as human beings.
Why so many physicists fled to United States and not other countries? I think it's a really important question for a historian of science. I can't have a definitive answer because history of, especially of the middle of the 20th century and after, is still really in progress. And we need biographical studies about all these people and to trace their parcours. I don't know. Story. But as I said, the United States were already the first dominant economy in the world and wanted to make its universities and research system and science grow rapidly, and so was inviting a lot of European scientists during all the 30s and proposed them position, etc. And with a Europe threatening to destroy itself in war, obviously people won't flee to France and nowhere in continental Europe. So some of them fled in the Great Britain or Ireland, but effectively it's United States that were their first choice. And
Medov.
I read somewhere that before World War II, when the Nazism started spreading around Europe, Niels Bohr asked one of physicists associated with him, I don't remember the name unfortunately, to go to the Soviet Union to investigate the possibility for European physicists to go to the Soviet Union, because many of them were left-wing people, and for them Soviet Union would be the country of the choice. But the result of this visit was that the paranoia of Stalin was so big that he would suspect that every foreigner is a potential spy, that it wasn't possible. And then the US benefited a lot from this, actually. But it was much later.
After, yeah. But
That's a
yeah,
very
very
particular
right.
story, very individual, I think. Other question, other comments? Rodin.
I think there was a comment about Europe and the role that science plays in the process of Europe unification. I think it's a very important point. This really has generated CERN, and in fact we talked about Gargamel this morning. Certainly this was a European collaboration, and this would not have existed without CERN. So, and this is a very, very important discovery. It's already 40 years old. And I think we have to make sure that this continues. We tend to take it for granted, and even some individual labs feel a bit threatened because everything goes to CERN. But I mean, it's a process that's continuing. There's the European Spallation Source, which is happening. There's various European organizations. But I think we need to pay attention, not to take it for granted, and to make it continue and get stronger. Because it's really the thing that works best in all the European organizations is science. And I think it's a fantastic thing we have. We need to make it continue. Now, the last thing we did is to take neutrino off the program of CERN, with no more neutrino beams in CERN. I think it's a pity, but we need to continue fight for it.
Alain, you must be very young because CERN is 64 years old and not 40. Okay, that's one thing. And the second thing, one of the important things was that, you know, one of the people who really, really tried very hard to, I mean, there were several people. One of them was, of course, Pierre Roger. I mean, without him, there would have been nothing, no CERN. He was in the UNESCO, and it was very, very important. And the other one was Heisenberg. Heisenberg didn't want to be isolated after the war, so he really worked very, very hard. And if you look at the first members of Scientific Policy Committee of CERN, they were great people, really great. Like, I mean, there were Niels Bohr, there was Blackett, there were, I mean, all these people, Nobel Prize winners, all of them. And then it started decaying a little bit because even I became a member.
No, that's a comment by Mr. Rickello.
I just wanted to compliment Alain with the question of CERN in the sense that I remember working with EGFA and IGFA in the 1970s and 80s, and at that time SLAC and DAISY appeared as they were national labs. And the discussion said that CERN was an obsolete model. It was, it had diplomatic status, it had governmental representatives, it was old-fashioned, it was something that was going to die out, and to make new advances in building new research infrastructures would have to be on a national basis. There would be one nation taking the lead and others helping, but the international kind of organization that CERN represented was necessarily going to die out. And in fact, CERN is now the prime high-end physics lab in the world. The model, that was really, the prediction was wrong. I can say that CERN now represents, I mean, the most long-lived, successful lab in the world. I don't say that that will be forever, but this really resides on international collaboration, not that a single nation takes a lead. I think that we also see now, for example, the Sesame lab, which is not a synchrotron lab, but it's modeled on CERN in the Middle East, in Jordania, which had first beams this year, first experiments. And there is also now a move to have such an international lab in the former Yugoslavian Eastern Europe. I think the model of so the internationalism of science has also found a model in this kind of international organization, which I think is rather than nationalistic labs. I think this is also a good sign for the future development of mankind. Thank you.
Thank you. Somebody else can.
I think you have forgotten something, which is Japan. It is amazing how Japan joined the international effort, in particular in this discipline. It's true that it was first in the theoretical part, but all of a sudden it was a worldwide actor with people like Yukawa, Tomonaga, and so on and so forth. I think it's and then after the war, it even took more a main play role in science. I think you have forgotten somehow Asia and Japan.
It's true, it's true. And I think it's not only mine fault. It's the work of historians to layers after layers find out what have been forgotten in an unjustifiable way, and the story is written by the winners. So the work of the historians is to go behind each time the discourse built by each period, and finding what was the true contribution to some countries that were judged at some moment, at some point by some people as peripheral to international science. Maybe we're not as peripheral as that. And so my short answer is, yes, there is far less work in history of science for the moment about contemporary science in Japan than in Europe and US, and that's a problem, yeah.
I would like to say the Japanese were, before the war, very well integrated in international collaboration. All of the people, like people Nishina, and so on. All these people, Yukawa, Nishina, you met Tomonaga, all of them have spent years in Europe, for example. They had worked in all places, they were good friends of very successful European scientists. So it's not true that they had been isolated, not at all. They were really part of this big family of scientists. So for them it was easy to come back again.
I think that everything has been said, okay? Not more. Thank you very much, and we conclude.